Hello, welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I am the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to tonight's special program called Harriet's Political Will, Black Women's Electoral Strength in an Era of Fractured Politics. Tonight's program is part of a week-long program on the status of Black women called Her Dream Deferred, organized in collaboration with the African American Policy Forum. Tonight's program has two parts. First, we'll get to see a short play about Harriet Tubman and her legacy, and immediately afterwards, we'll have a panel on Black women as a driving force in the fight for equality and justice. The panelists are all political heavyweights of their own right. Attorney Barbara Arnwine, Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza, CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson, California State Assembly member Sidney Kamlager Dove, and moderator Kimberly Crenshaw. And now I'd like to welcome the brainchild of Her Dream Deferred to the stage to introduce the play we're about to see. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of the African American Policy Foundation and Professor of Law at UCLA and Columbia Law School, Kimberly Crenshaw.
Good evening. It is a distinct pleasure to be with you tonight and to share a labor of love on the part of the African American Policy Forum and our friends here at the Hammer Museum. The piece that you are about to see was created over a period of a couple of months with some wonderful artists that I will introduce to you during our panel discussion. But I wanted to give you a little bit of the context of this piece. Some of you might remember that a couple years ago it was announced that Harriet Tubman's face was going to grace the $20 bill. That was a moment that we celebrated. And at the same time, I thought it was really odd and ironic that her face would be on the $20 bill, basically because Harriet died absolutely destitute. And in fact, one of the struggles that she had for much of her life after the end of the Civil War was to get paid. It was a constant focal point of her life. And the reason that she wanted to get paid was that she understood that the pathway to freedom was only partially walked by the Emancipation Proclamation, by the end of the Civil War, by the 13th Amendment. There was much more that was necessary. And she was a person who very much wanted to create a home, a place for the dispossessed, to find safety, to find support, to just be clothed and fed. And unlike some of the male leaders of the Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction, Harriet didn't really get the same kind of resources that they got in order to carry her vision forward. In fact, when she finally was able to receive some kind of compensation, she didn't get full compensation for all the things that she had done. She didn't get compensation for recruiting freedmen to fight for the Union cause. She didn't get it for being a scout, for organizing raids, for going behind enemy lines, for being a medic. She didn't really get resources for that. What she was primarily able to get resources as was a wife of a private who was in the Union. And that really stuck with me because at the time we were having a lot of discussions and debates about the racial justice project of the then Obama administration, which didn't have Black women or women of color at the center of it. So the basic idea was that Black women's economic development would be dependent upon their relationship to someone else in the same way that Harriet Tubman's was. So I thought it was such an interesting contradiction that on one hand, her picture was on a $20 bill, the plans were that, and on the other hand, the economic well-being of Black women was still being framed in a heteronormative, patriarchal way. So it made me wonder what Harriet would have to say if she came back now? What lessons would she try to teach young Black women right now? And what is the legacy that she gives to us now? So when we first put this on, we did it in like 3 days, and it kind of looked like it. Now we have had the benefit of a wonderful partnership with the Hammer Museum. So it is my great pleasure to present to you Harriet's daughters. Thank you.
Items from that period, ranging from clothing to cooking implements and provisions that may have been used by runaways from 1860 to 1868. And in the middle, we have the statue of Harriet Tubman.
Okay, time to move on to the Gilded Age. Right this way. That's right.
Right this way.
We have, that's right this way. We have the world's largest collection of bustles and detached bosoms, as well as collections from the daughters of
Harriet Tubman, 1824 through 1913. Moses, the general, conductor of the Underground Railroad, freed over 70 slaves. I could have freed a lot more if they'd only known they were slaves. Now I heard that. You ain't never lied, Miss Tubman.
Oh! That's right. Never have and never will. Of course, there are a mess of folks that think they's free only to find out too late that there's not. Like my sorry husband, John Tubman, fool. Went all the way back, brought him a fine suit, a smart hat. Would look better than the day we were married. But he didn't want no part of freedom. Didn't want no part of me either. Broke me in two. But that's a story I can't worry about right now. Got to tend to some business. Now, what year are we in?
Harriet? I mean, Ms. Tubman? Is that you?
Of course, child. Who else could I be? Now, we are a bit lost, aren't we, sister? But don't you worry. Mother Harriet is here. Now where are you off to?
Well, Mother Harriet, I was just looking around, going nowhere in particular.
Whew.
I feel like we're moving.
You want to sit down, sister?
Moving backwards.
Nowhere in particular. Ain't that something? I ain't never had nowhere in particular to be. I can't remember a time that I didn't have a bushel of jobs and a whole bunch of stuff to do. By the time I was 19, I had worked from sunup to sundown for 13 years. By then, I figured I'd hire myself away from my master, which I did. And I saved up enough to buy 2 oxen, and I broke facts, and I cleaned houses, and I made bricks, and I freed slaves, and what else did I do? Fed armies, tended wounds,
Lead rays.
led raids, and in all this time, I done never gotten around wandering around aimlessly myself.
Oh,
But if you looking to find yourself, daughter, then Mother Harriet is here, and I'm here to help you set on your way.
Mother Harriet, how's this possible for you to be here, or me to be in 1886?
Well, I
5, 4, oh my God. What's happening?
Now, child, I can't say, but I did have a vision that there was something going on down here big related to Mother Harriet's money. And I figure all those white folks who don't give me what I'm due, that's what made the earth shatter and whatnot. And then all that thundering and lightning, I bet it's all them other white folks rolling in their graves. So, with all this shaking and rolling, I think we're in a time flux. And I'm going to go back and set things straight. That's what I'm going to do.
Okay. Well,
Mother Harriet's getting paid, and while we're at it, we're going to get some things straight.
oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Do this thing.
Here.
Look.
Look.
Do that for me, Raymond.
Sure.
Now, what you going to show me?
This. Look. I think this is what you saw. You're on our $20 bill. That's your currency now. Well, not your currency, but this is to honor you.
A $20 bill? My father paid $20 to get my mother away from Master when she couldn't work. A $20 bill? That's what the government think I'm worth? That's what they gonna pay me as a veteran of the war? Well, isn't it funny how we was worth more when we were owned by slaves, when we were owned by Massa, than we were owned right by ourselves? Lincoln paid a whole bunch of money to get rid of us. And then once we were free, weren't worth a dime. And we weren't worth a dime to ourselves either. Well, I might not have no money, but I did have sense enough. Oh, here. And even my white friends like to say, hey, you ignorant. But I had sense enough to get my family free, and a whole bunch of others too, right under their noses. Got them all except my sister and her babies. Oh. But I'm going back to fix that right now. Do that for me, sister. Now you let me know when that thing gets back to 1858.
Will do.
You know, there are a whole lot of folks who are literate, and they don't know how to do squat.
But, Mother Harriet, how did you manage to get free and go back again and again, and why risk it now?
Okay, now listen up. You just gotta be ready and pay attention and use the fact that they can see right through you to your advantage. Do you know how many times I went back? Well, right by Massa, and he didn't see me. Right by him. No one can see me that I don't want to. Haven't you figured that out already? Now, ooh, honey, child, wait a minute now. My skirt can't go with my skirt falling down. That's not gonna work. Let me show you something else. You see this? Watch. Ba-boom! I got one for you over here. Oh, you did that for me? Thank you. Now listen, my sister is going to be on the auction block this Sunday. And this is my last chance to get her. Now listen, you put this in your bag. You got a bag? You don't have a bag, but we're going to get you a bag. You put that one in your bag. Oh. And come on, we got to get it before the auction block. Let's go. Come on.
trouble the water. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
celebration here at Fort Knox after Union forces successfully staged a stealth mission up the Combahee River, the homes of some of the wealthiest planters in the nation. Last night, 700 contraband were set free by gunboats in a mission commanded by a black female runaway slave. Crowds have now come from all over to see her. This person they call Moses. Joining me here are eyewitnesses to the raids that sacked plantations, destroyed crops, and storehouses. Here is Sally Lemmings. Sally, tell us about what happened yesterday.
Well, the sun had just fully come up, and we were already in the fields when we heard what must have been the trumpet of Gabriel. Now, we've been told to be ready for a great signal, and ready we were. When I heard it, I knew the Lord's son come down to set us free, so I threw that old cotton-picking bag and set to running with the clothes on my back. I heard Miss Ann from the veranda up there saying, "Get back here." Oh, but I knew them days were over at last. When I got to the boat, I saw her, the one they call Moses, black, just like me, and a woman just like me standing right there, pointing and directing, working to set us free. And then, before I could barely blink, that old master's big house of horrors was set afire. The crops, the fields, anything that couldn't walk or be carried was set aflame. Oh, I always knew the sword of the Lord was coming, but I never imagined it would come at the command of someone who looked just like me. I know it was God. Sent the general to open up the kingdom for us all. Freedom! Oh, so sweet. Amen.
And who was this woman?
Oh, there she is. Harriet Tubman. The great deliverer.
And we also have here Binta, who ran to freedom yesterday.
Well, I was cooking a pot of rice for lunch, tending to 3 children when I heard the trumpet. Got the children wrapped around my waist. The pot of rice still steaming on a cloth on my head. And 2 pigs, one white, one black, trailing behind. And ran like the dickens out of the hell. Even carrying all of that, I was the first to the boat. And handed the children and the pigs over to Moses. Now she got to calling them girl and boy. The pigs, that is. That means freedom done come. And we not going back. Amen! Every last one of us was doing something when we threw off that yoke of bondage.
I was tending to Master's children.
I was cooking Master's breakfast.
I was washing Mrs. Sheets.
I was shoeing Master's horses.
I was hoeing Master's soil.
I was carrying Master's wood.
I was warming Master's bed.
And we all came when Harriet called.
Of course, it's not all celebration here among the planters. Some say the pillaging and confiscation of the slaves is nothing more than a war crime. Miss Ann, tell us about yesterday for your family.
Why, it's only the vilest, most frightening, traumatizing experience I've ever had. They stole everything, ran like they were possessed by the devil. Ungrateful savages, after all we've done for them.
So, Miss Ann, how many ungrateful savages ran away?
Well, all of them. Now we are left with nothing. The crop is destroyed. Our home's been in the family for generations. Now burnt to ash. But we will rise again. Once we are compensated for the loss of our
Sorry to
slaves, the
interrupt, but it
South will
appears
rise
that Harriet Tubman is here.
again.
The crowd is going back.
Well, here, daughter, you sit right here. And we got plenty of time for me to rest my bones before we see Mr. Seward about my money. Why don't you read to me, daughter, while I rest my eyes?
Mr. Seward. Mother, who is Mr. Seward who has your money?
Oh, forgive Mother for forgetting. I forgot that you're not quite here yet. Now, Mr. Seward is the Secretary of State, appointed by President Lincoln himself. Now, Mr. Seward is supposed to give me my money. Get paid just like the veterans, just like them war men. Last time I saw him, he told me to come back after all this trouble was over to get my money.
Right. Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State. You're saying you know the Secretary of State?
Yes, child, and the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton. Don't you know how many white folks done proved that I don't know nothing about any of these people? About all the folks I've been talking about, prove to them that I don't know them. Wait, all through the war, I had this paper giving me free passage to all vessels, ships, trains. And white folks always trying to test me to see if I really knew the man.
Grant this bearer, Harriet Tubman, a trusted Union asset, full and free passage on any vessel under the jurisdiction of this seal.
Right. Read it.
Secretary Stanton.
Oh, I sure hope he don't make me stay for dinner like last time. Oh, he about talked my head off. Sometimes I go on like I just went in a dead sleep, right off in the middle of all that talking. And of course, they don't think I can hear them, but of course I can. Ooh, is she in a trance? Is that some sort of voodoo stuff? What is that? What is that? And then all of a sudden, I start acting really, really crazy. I put on a real big show, and I'm fluttering my eyes, and I'm speaking and everything. And then they say, ooh, what's that? Is she in a trance? What is that? And then I start speaking really, really low, so they can't hear me. So they lean over to try to listen. And then I scream, watch out! The patrolman gonna get you. Woo! And they jump clear across the room. And there's Mr. Secretary Seward, big man, Mr. Stanton, Secretary of War, getting all shaking in his boots, scared of little old me, little old black me. Ooh, I love that. Ooh, that one did me good. Now, all I have to do is get $200 right now. I can get that down payment for that home that I'm trying to fix up for the men and women from the war I'm set free.
It's a new day. There's the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and even the Freedmen's Bureau. The freed people got the law on their side. Heck, the whole country on their side now. And it says here that the vote is coming too. With that, black folk will be able to look out for themselves.
The vote won't free us. Everybody's got to be free, both men and women. And black women work just as hard as black men, and just as hard as white women. Getting half a bushel, working the same job. Yeah, we're told to go around to the big door, to the back house, and yes, I'm this, and yes, I'm that. But you know what? Frederick Douglass said this is the Negro hour. But I think it's the Negro women's hour. And I'm going to tell them that when we get down there. Oh, yes, I'm going to say something to Fred about that.
Now look here. You know full well that this train is not the car for colored women. You're disturbing the other passengers in here, so I need you to follow me to the smoking car.
Well, I ain't never been colored. Now, you can call me black, or you can call me a Negro or black, but you certainly can't call me colored. And I'm certainly not moving to that other room or that other train. I'm not moving. I'm not going anywhere. We have every right to be here. This is the ladies' car. sitting
did you
right.
say to me?
I said we're ladies and we're sitting right here.
Why, this is just outrageous. Imagine these darkies now telling us what they will and will not do.
I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. You're coming out of this car.
Wait, she's done nothing wrong. She has a pass. Here, look. Do you know who this is? This is Harriet Tubman, the General Moses.
Get off me!
Who can I talk
Get
to?
off me!
Who is in charge? I need to talk to somebody.
Get off me! Stop!
Help us! Help us, please.
Get off me!
Oh no!
Get off
no.
me! Let go! Let go of me! I have every right to be here.
Mother Harriet, the war has been over 30 years now. It's 1895. You remained a general and conductor of the Underground Railroad, freed more than 700 slaves, and recruited most all the men to the Union side to boot.
Yep. Still waiting on the money per head for that, too.
You saved the commander and all of them that had the fever with your root medicine.
You ain't been paid for that.
Had a network of spies to keep up with the Confederate movement, and even went behind Confederate movements went behind Confederate lines yourself.
Ain't been paid for that. I've been more being paid for a widow from my second husband, a private, than I got for being a veteran myself.
You are waiting to be paid what is yours.
Yeah, and not just for me, but for all those women and men who come out of slavery who have nothing to their name.
What now, Mother Harriet?
For now, sweetie, you can take that. And for my daughters, the ones who are always ready, thank you. Tell them that Mother Harriet is always here. Oh, wait now. One more thing. I gotta give you my shawl. Here you go.
So now I'd like to introduce part 2 of tonight's special program. We have a panel of brilliant women who are all deeply engaged in contemporary social and political issues. They're here with us tonight to talk about how Black women continue to be a driving force in the fight for equality and justice. Barbara Arnwine is the founder and president of the Transformative Justice Coalition, an organization that advocates for racial, gender, economic, environmental, and other forms of social justice. Arnwine also teaches at the North Carolina Central University School of Law. She's the president emeritus of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and in 2011 she created the legendary Voting Rights Map of Shame. Alicia Garza is an internationally recognized organizer, writer, and public speaker. We're all going to come up together. Who co-founded the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. In 2018, Alicia founded the Black Futures Lab, which works to make Black people powerful in politics. Currently, as the Strategy and Partnerships Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Garza works to place domestic workers at the forefront of the movement to change the domestic work industry and to build an economy that places people over profits. Her writing and work has been featured in Time, The Guardian, Essence Magazine, and The New York Times. She's received numerous awards and honors, including the Sydney Peace Prize, and she was a member of the 2016 Tribunal of the U.S. Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission held at the United Nations. Nia Malika Henderson is a senior political reporter for CNN, reporting on politics, policies, and people shaping Washington. Henderson reports for the network's digital and television platforms and regularly appears as a panelist on the CNN programs Inside Politics, The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and CNN Tonight with Don Lemon. Henderson covered the 2016 election, the presidential transition, and now covers Donald Trump's administration and the Democratic Party. Prior to joining CNN, she was a national political reporter for The Washington Post, where she covered the White House, the 2012 presidential campaign, the 2010 midterms, and anchored the Post's election 2012 blog. She also covered the first 2 years of the Obama administration for Politico, and was Newsday's lead reporter covering Obama's 2008 campaign, the Democratic primary race, and the Democratic National Convention. Before joining Newsday's national staff, she wrote for the Baltimore Sun. Sydney Kamlager-Dove is a teacher and frequent speaker on education issues, economic development, and the arts, among other topics. In 2015, she became the second African-American woman ever elected president of the Los Angeles Community College District, serving over 250,000 students. She also served as the district director for California State Senator Holly J. Mitchell. She now serves as my assembly member for the great state of California since her election to the California State Assembly in a special election in 2018, where I had the privilege of voting for her. And her special areas of focus are education, criminal justice reform, and poverty. Kimberly Crenshaw, professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law School, is a leading authority on civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. She is the founding coordinator of the Critical Race Theory Workshop and co-editor of the volume Critical Race Theory: Key Documents That Shaped the Movement. Her groundbreaking work on intersectionality has traveled globally and was influential in the drafting of the Equality Clause in the South African Constitution. Crenshaw is the executive director of the African American Policy Forum, a gender and racial justice legal think tank, and the founder of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School. She's a leading voice in calling for a gender-inclusive approach to racial justice interventions, and she spearheaded the Why We Can't Wait campaign and co-authored 2 important and influential policy reports, Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Over-Policed, and Underprotected, and Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women. So now please join me in welcoming Barbara Arnwine, Alicia Garza, Nia Malika Henderson, Sydney Kamlager-Dove, and Kimberly Crenshaw.
Good evening. Well, it is really a special honor to share the stage with some of my heroes. We are really looking forward to an inspired conversation. Before I get started, though, there's some people I have to thank. I mentioned that we put this performance together basically in an apartment over a couple of days. And I have my artist in residence to thank for that. Dina Wright Joseph, who was our choreographer, Fia Walkingtree, who was our conductor of the musicians, and Abby Dobson, who you heard her mesmerizing voice. So first wanted to acknowledge their incredible role in collectivizing artistic production. I also want to thank Darcy Krager and Vane Asadarian, who directed this play for us here at the Hammer. It really is a learning for me to see artists at work and how they can bring to life a vision that kind of just sits in your head for a while. So it was really a lot of fun working on this. The entire point of the play is to provide a new predicate or a new point of departure for thinking about the historical legacy of Black women's political struggle and its contemporary dimensions. So we've gotten together to talk a little bit about some of the resonances of Harriet's legacy for today. And part of that conversation involves looking very closely at what is unfolding now in the country as we're moving to 2020. So I wanted to start, first of all, by just giving us a little bit of an opportunity to think back about what was resonant in this particular performance and what we can bring forward. So Barbara, I'm going to start with you. So next year will be the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It is a moment where history is making itself, I guess, present. We have all kinds of celebrations that are happening all over the place. It is the Women's Hour, as we were told, somewhat in contrast to the line in the play where Harriet talks about Frederick Douglass saying it's the Negroes' hour. So there was a Negroes' hour, and then there was a Women's Hour, and I'm wondering, when was the Black Women's Hour?
Well, I think that the bad news, everyone, is that as people will gather next year in 2020 to celebrate the 100, I say you better minus 45, because it would take Black women another 45 years to get the right to vote. Even though Black women were at the forefront of the suffragist movement and were outspoken about the right of women to vote. And their stories, Ida B. Wells Barnett and so many others, they're amazing stories of their struggle. They will tell you, of course, that they were told to march at the back of the line behind the white women during the various suffragist movement marches. Yet, our sisters, being sisters, they came to the front and took their place. Now, they could not, change that when it came to all these states that were engaging in that era of voter suppression. I think also people need to know that even before we got to the women's vote, that Harriet Tubman, even in her destitution in 1896, she is the keynote speaker at the National Black Women's Political Convention. And she is the keynote speaker there. We are trying to find some record of that speech. But just think about it, that she is still powerful enough to gather women from around the country and to give not just a rendition of her life, but a political direction for Black women. So that legacy needs to be lifted up. It's gotten lost. It's almost like, her story ends the minute the Civil War is over. But it didn't. There's so much. We'll come back to Harriet again. And because there's so much that she did politically that we ought to learn from now. And we'll come back to that. But I just wanted to, open with that just observation that the women's movement will never be whole, will never be complete until it reconciles the true story of its origin and the true story of its betrayal of black women and the true story of the embrace that really has to occur of our agenda and our issues. Thank you.
Yes, Barbara, thank you for that. And we might linger here for a moment because when we fast forward to the future, we're going to be talking about this thing called the women's vote. We're going to be talking about this notion of, is there a political coalition around, women's issues? And it behooves us to think about that through a historical lens. So we do know that in the aftermath of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, there was a split.
Yes.
The suffragettes at some point broke off,
Yes.
from the anti-slavery part of the political establishment. And not only did they break off, they broke off in a big way and began to say some things that have, in some ways, hindered coalition between black women and white women for a generation. What's the significance of their breaking off? And some of the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony had to say about how they felt about black men getting the vote before white women did.
Well, they felt that it was really ugly because they said things like, these uneducated, unclean black men getting the right to vote before educated, proper white women was just unacceptable. And it was a really vicious, cycle because what we don't hear in any of this debate, because the voices of the white women and Susan B. Anthony, who had this long relationship with Frederick Douglass, in struggle. We know some of those stories, but what we don't have is enough of the record of what black women were saying during that time. Because let's be straight, that it wasn't just white women who were discontented that they were denied the right to vote when black men got the right to vote. That black women also had some say about that because they wanted to have their power heard also. So what we basically did in response to all of this madness is that we do what we always do. We created our own clubs. We created an entire national movement called the Black Women's Club movement that was absolutely powerful. So that when the 1895 movement convention of the National Convention of Colored Women is held in Boston in 1895, there are something like 42 major black women clubs that are represented there from over 18 states. And black women are coming and they are saying powerful messages about their anger at the stereotype, their anger at the fact that they're caught betwixt and between. They're caught between the white men, white women, and they're caught between the black men. And they, in fact, there's that famous book title, All the men are the blacks are men, blacks, all the women are white. All the blacks are men and all the women are white. And we're still caught up in that dynamic, and that's why your creation of the broad concept of intersectionality, to put this into context and not only perspective, but to really force the policy discussion that we gotta have in this country about how we give full voice and full power to black women. Yes, thank you, Barbara. I'm struck. I'm struck by the vision of the Black Women's Club movement, which is often not talked about as a political formation.
Very much
right? It tends to be talked about as a cultural formation, lifting as we climb, the idea that the work they were doing was domestic, but in fact it was very much a political formation, and in part the failure to lift that up is a part of the erasure of black women's political history, in the same way that Harriet Tubman as a political actor has been erased. So we literally see her like we saw her at the beginning of the play, like a statue, that sort of her relevant life as a leader ended at the end of the Civil War. So one of the things we seem to be battling now is against the erasure of our history and against the valorization of white women's suffragist history without talking about the racial dimensions of it. So one of the questions then is, what is the contemporary dimension of that? And for this, Nia, I want to come to you. In talking about, in this current political moment, how race and gender dynamics are playing out in political discourse now. There's a whole lot of, projection and discussion about what 2020 looks like. So a lot of times race and gender considerations don't announce themselves in the way people talk about politics. But yet there is a sense that actually these are race and gender discourses. So help us decode what's being talked about.
Yeah, so the obvious ways race and gender are talked about are the field, right? It's a huge field. It's the most diverse field in history. More women, the Democratic field, more women running than ever. It's 5 women. You have Kamala Harris, who announces her candidacy with echoes of Shirley Chisholm, who of course ran for the White House in 1972. So you have that kind of field represented in a way in which people can easily talk about race and gender. What does this mean? It's a reflection of sort of the new woke era, right, in the Democratic Party. It's an echo of what we saw in 2018 with all of those candidates in the House being ushered in, the most diverse House we've ever seen in terms of the Democratic side, powered there by women, stars who've emerged like AOC and Ayanna Pressley, Lucy McBath, people like that. So that's one obvious way we talk about it, right? The other, I think, more complicated, less obvious, and I think uncomfortable ways in which people are talking about race is this whole idea of electability, right? And who are the candidates who are thought of as the electable candidates, right? And so I think this is pretty obvious. It's the white male candidates. It's Joe Biden, thought of as electable because he supposedly has some magical power in the Midwest to have voters who voted for Trump to vote for him. Beto O'Rourke, another candidate thought to have this sort of superpower of making Trump voters vote for him. If you look at a lot of the data in Texas, I think he got about 3% of Trump voters. So, and Stacey Abrams, by the way, got 2% of Trump voters in Georgia. So they're she apparently doesn't have the same magical power that Beto O'Rourke does. I'm not sure why. Right? Yeah, she doesn't jump on counters. And so that is, I think, the way in which we're talking about electability, but it really is about, in some ways, the power of being white, the power of being white and male. And so that, I think, in some ways, I think we are at a point, at least, if you look at a lot of folks who are writing, talking on television about this field, there is a way in which we're recognizing and talking about white male identity in a way that we didn't before, and in a way that wasn't so comfortable before for a lot of people. One of the ways that people talk about it is this idea that somehow white men are at a disadvantage in this field, right? Because apparently there's a real appetite for an African-American woman or a black man or, which is absurd, the idea that somehow being white and male all of a sudden is a burden, right? It's called white male privilege, right? It's not called white male disadvantage. So these are sort of all of the dynamics that are at play in this race that is very much going to be about race and gender. And it's obviously heightened by Donald Trump, who talks about race and talks about gender in very obvious ways, right? You think about past Republican candidates. In many ways, they basically, sort of the dog whistle way of talking about race and gender. And if you're Donald Trump, you've basically decided to really openly play with white identity politics. And you saw that in obviously the returns and some of the anxiety that white voters had about some of the demographic shifts. So you have, I think, in the Democratic side, a real reaction to that and a grappling with what it means to be a woke Democrat, what it means to, if you're Joe Biden, like how do you deal with this new era where you have to account for what he did with Anita Hill.
Yes.
He keeps talking about this in the same way. He said, well, I owe her an apology, and a lot of people are saying, well, you actually didn't apologize to her, right?
Right.
She's still waiting on that apology. He's talking, for instance, about violence against women. And one of the things he said recently, this was an interview he gave, I think it was yesterday, and he blamed white male culture for violence, right, and violence against women, which when I heard that, I was like, my goodness. I mean, he almost sounds like sort of like a black nationalist, like talking about, sort of like, the white man. And so you wonder if that is going to be a good idea for him to have used those words, right? But again, this is him trying to figure out how to sound like a woke white man. Right? And I think it's proving very difficult for him. And we'll see where that goes. We'll see if he runs for the White House. But you can see him sort of signaling that this is important, this diversity that's in the Democratic Party, name-dropping Stacey Abrams, this idea that maybe there would be a ticket with Stacey Abrams. So, this is going to be a fascinating race. I think it's obviously a diverse field, and we talk about that when we talk about Kamala Harris, you talk about Cory Booker, but it's also going to be a field that could be half white men, right? If there are 14 candidates, it could literally be 14 white men, 2 of whom are named John Hickenlooper and John Delaney. So that is what the field could look like. And so when you hear all of, kind of buzzwords about electability, in many ways it's talking about whiteness, it's talking about maleness, and a lot of the metrics we're going to be talking about in terms of who's a front runner and who's strong are again about race, right? If you think about why Biden is on top, it's about name recognition. If you think about the ways in which Beto O'Rourke, for instance, is leading in fundraising, $6.1 million or something, typically African Americans don't necessarily donate to political campaigns. Obama, only 8% of the money that he raised came from African Americans. So if you're Kamala Harris, you've raised like $1.5 million. And so by that metric of money raising, she might not look like the strongest candidate. So all of these ways in which I think, very obvious ways we talk about race, and then in not so obvious ways. So, buckle up.
Well, so in many ways, there are a lot of things that are on the table, in this race. Some part of it is a battle for, the discursive high ground. So when I very much appreciate your introducing the white identity dimension of it, because for the most part, identity politics gets attached to Kamala Harris,
exactly,
to Stacey. It doesn't get attached to Biden, right?
Right.
Even while the conversation is explicitly, how are we going to get the white working class back? So I like watch TV and I was like, do you not realize when you say that you are engaging in identity politics?
Yeah.
It may be white identity politics, but it's still identity politics. So how can they continuously frame it in an obviously identitarian way, but yet at the same time make it seem like our choices and our candidates are not? So I'm wondering about this. My colleague Luke Harris has a phrase for it. He says that so much of the debate nowadays is about diminished overrepresentation of white men. Diminished overrepresentation. It's still overrepresented.
Right.
It's still, but that little diminishment is a constitutional crisis for people, right? So it seems like a lot of this is playing out in what you're describing. The flip side is there does seem to be something about the fact that Black women are I sometimes call it the wheels of the bus. So is that an exaggeration to say that Black women's political mobilization is a driving force in democratic possibilities, not necessarily power, but possibilities?
Right. So if you look at the participation rate of African American women, say over the last 30 years, starting in 1984 or so, it's about 60%, right? Meaning the percentage of Black women who are eligible to vote actually voting. And they're sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of white men are higher and white women are higher in terms of their participation rate. You fast forward to 2008, and Black women in that election set a record for voter participation. It's like 68% in 2008. It's 70% in 2012, right? So you can see, a lot of times you talk about Obama's victory, and then there's this idea of the surge of African American voters, like 2 million extra African American voters, and a lot of that was powered by African American women, because the Black vote is powered by African American women. They're about 60% or so of the overall Black vote, and Black men about 45%. So yes, and you see this showing up in other races. You see it showing up, for instance, in the Doug Jones race in Alabama. You see it showing up in the Terry McAuliffe race. You see it showing up also in the Northam race, the governor, the black-faced governor. I think you remember him. But yeah, Black women supported him and even supported him after the blackface incident. And so yes, you do see that power. And then even if you think about 2012, you think about 2008, and you think about 2016, the sole way that Hillary Clinton is able to get the nomination is because Black women in Georgia vote for her in record numbers. Black women in South Carolina vote for her in record numbers. I mean, all of those southern states, she just cleans up by connecting with African American voters, primarily African American women, who dominate the Democratic Party in the South. They just run everything in terms of Democratic politics in the South. So you fast forward again to 2020, what does this look like for all of these candidates in terms of trying to appeal to African American voters, primarily African American women voters? What does that look like for a candidate like Kamala Harris, again giving a nod to Shirley Chisholm, giving a nod to the AKAs? She's a member of that sorority, having part of her announcement at Howard University. So you can tell, I mean, she obviously would be strong among that group. Somebody like Biden thinks he would be too. We'll see if he is. But I think one of the other things you hear from Black women is this real desire to fight. I was down in Alabama with Hillary Clinton and a couple other candidates, and just a woman came up to me, and she was just like, I'm not angry, but I do want to fight, but I want to fight to win. I mean, there is a real kind of sense of urgency among the Black women I talk to, and I think you're going to see that show up. What does that mean in terms of how the candidates can connect with them? What sort of issues they bring up? Criminal justice reform. You've got Kamala Harris talking about teachers, giving teachers a raise. Obviously, a lot of African American women in the South are teachers, and then white women across the country as well. But yeah, so there is this power in terms of Black women at the voting booth, but you don't necessarily, I think you can probably talk about this, you don't necessarily see it in terms of representation, right?
Yes.
Never before a Black woman governor. Stacey Abrams came close, ran this amazing campaign in Georgia, obviously. Only one Black, or two Black women, I think, ever been elected, Senator Kamala Harris being one of them, Carol Moseley Braun being the other one. So there is this idea, I think, that still Black women aren't necessarily electable, right? Because, even people talk about Kamala Harris, you never necessarily hear the word electability attached to her
Right.
in terms of being president. She's typically talked about as somebody who can run in tandem as a VP, right, with Biden.
But not in her own right.
Right, in her right.
And some part of that electability issue has to do with the voting behavior of white women. I'm really taken by the overwhelming support that black women gave Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And the opposite with respect to Stacey. I think it was like 77% of white women, voted for her opponent. So if we were even able to, approach a very small percentage of white women voting patterns that was clearly what was the formula that put Hillary in contention. If we were able to move beyond, I use this term asymmetric solidarity, right? So black women are there for a whole lot of people that ain't there for them. We're there for our brothers. And I'm about to come to you because I'm thinking about, so yes, there is this political power, but it doesn't necessarily translate to seeing the number of black women elected that we would think that level of power in the voting booth would translate to. So what is it that we are not seeing or understanding in terms of the barriers, the obstacles, the conditions in which black women move from being politically active to actually being candidates to actually becoming elected?
There are so many barriers. We don't even have enough time this evening. I was thinking on the way over here, I just came back from Sacramento. We had a number of tough votes in a public safety. I sit on public safety committee, and they're hard conversations that you're having because we use these strange definitions about who's suffering from mental health illness and who's a criminal and who should be fined and given assessments and penalties and when should we revoke these, and who really deserves restorative justice and who really should be locked up. And I was thinking all day Tuesday and today, that when we're talking about race and gender, that your privilege does not trump my existence, right? And you have to say that in these spaces. We are in the most progressive state, some would argue, in the nation, California. We have 40 million people living here. We have 4 African American women in the Senate and in the Assembly combined. We have 1 black female senator, and we have 3 African American Assembly women. And none of us represent a majority African American or a majority of color district. And so all of us were elected because of white voters, male and female, who for one reason or another probably decided to look toward values over, racial representation and are giving us a pass. I could not go out and drum up enough black women voters to keep me in this seat if I tried, because we are just not here. We also have to have real conversations about the fact that as we look at the map of all of the districts, the 120 districts that make up this state of California, if we are looking to run black women, they too will be running in non-majority black districts. Then you have to have a whole conversation about electability, about who is viable. Can you raise money? How much does it take? I ran in a special election. It was $1 million race. Now, I asked a lot of folks that look like me to give me some money. That certainly was not on the leaderboard in terms of givers, right? My folks. So who can raise the money? Who can actually get the machine behind you? I'm a Democrat. Most folks who are black, all of the folks actually who are black who are in the legislature are Democrats. You have to go through another machine, the Democratic Party. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. Less than 3% of the delegates that make up the California Democratic Party are African American women. 150. There are 150 black female delegates representing this state. We actually run chairs to be the party chair of the Democratic Party in all states. We have a race going on right now. We have a black sister running to be chair of the Democratic Party. There is no way in God's green earth that those 150 votes will be the only votes, that she will need to win, right? And so this sister has got to build a coalition and reach out to get other allies to help her succeed if she will be successful, right? So that means if the California Democratic Party wants to say, I want to have a black female agenda, where are black women on this platform? Who's going to vote for that? Out of thousands of delegates, right? We all won't be able to lead that charge to the front, right? Then so I have to say, as a result of that, because the sister ran before and there were some things that went down and she was not successful, as a result of that, I actually co-founded the Black Women's Democratic Club because I said, well, I'll be damned if we have to go through this again, or if any candidate comes before the party to get the nomination and to run, and to not have more black women at the seat of the table.
Right.
But it also means that we have to code switch, because we have to figure out how to both represent ourselves and then represent everyone else in a way that is appealing, right, and tasteful to folks who may not be accustomed to hearing about black issues.
And I want to go a little deeper into this issue because I recall after the re-election of Barack Obama, there was a whole conversation that really, it began in the first campaign, but then really took off, that there was a new generation of black elected officials. These are elected officials who are not black politicians, but politicians who happen to be black. It was sort of intermingled with this idea of post-racialism, which basically means that we are beyond race, which tended to be translated into, don't ask me to talk about anything black. Don't ask me to put on the agenda anything that might identify me as black. Yes. Don't ask me to carry the water for anything that might sour my reputation among the white voters that I need. So what I'm interested in is, how you have navigated that post-racial expectation, and B, do you think that it is possibly the case that black women, because they already are navigating stuff, they are black, they're women, they're many things, they don't get caught up in this idea that the only way I can be a black elected official is to deny every part of my constituents who are black and parts of myself?
So I don't think I have time to be anything other than who I am, and I'm an emancipated black woman. And so I let everyone know when I was walking around knocking on doors that was who I was and who I continue to be. I have to believe that voters are interested in authentic candidates that speak to them. And if you are letting folks know who you really are and then are stepping into the issues that are important to you, then, that's sort of, that's the sweet spot in terms of connecting with folks. And, I will always talk about affordability issues and income inequality. I will always talk about criminal justice reform. I will always talk about the need to renovate our public education system. I will always talk about ways that we can have pathways into the middle class. I will tell you, after the failed 2016 national election, the DNC called an emergency meeting of 50 or so black female electeds and stakeholders in the party. and said, we need some help because we thought we were going to win in all of these races, and we didn't. And so we all flew to D.C. in the summer, very humid, hair was, wide, to have a conversation. And we said, what was your agenda? What was the plan? How did you use Black women? How were we involved? And folks, many of these sisters were from the South. They said, because we were never engaged. Right. We were putting our own pennies together to figure out how to get these folks elected. And, where was the DNC? Right. And the DNC said, we don't have any money and we don't have a plan. We do not have a Black Sisters plan. And I was thankful that folks were honest, but it was really sobering. And we were coming up on the race with Stacey Abrams and a couple of others. And, we said, then just give this to us.
Let us handle
and give us a little bit of something, and then we will figure it out. Mm-hmm. And then we will come back to you in some months, and you better have a plan. Mm-hmm. But I have to tell you, for many of us who associate ourselves with the Democratic Party, it was disheartening to hear that this infrastructure had forgotten us and was yet dependent on us to keep it going, and at least was honest enough to say, we're still not that interested in you all Black sisters because we're still trying to get the disaffected white male vote. Yeah. And we said, well, that vote is probably gone for 8 years, so can you just come back to us? But sometimes you have to have those very real conversations, and we were there for a few hours trying to remind them that these were the sisters who've shown up and who are going to continue to show up to find candidates, to help them raise money, and to get them across the finish line. But that can be disheartening.
It's a little bit like that saying, they don't want to dance with the people that brung them to the party, right? So stepping for a moment outside of the immediate electoral arena to the broader political discourse, I want to go to you, Alicia. So we're in a moment where there are many different political waves that have happened, and of course you were at the center of one of them, Black Lives Matter. And I think it's fair to say that the leadership of that moment and that movement looks a little different than the leadership of anti-racist movements in the past, the acknowledged leadership, let me say that. At the same time, it seems like that difference made the difference, number one, and is also subject to backlash politics. So it's easy for us really to talk about sort of politics in the big, Democratic Party and, white voters who are still not ready to vote for Black people, and that's a constant. But there are also internal politics that are playing out. So I'm wondering how you can take us through sort of a mapping of some of the internal backlash politics and what that might portend for 2020.
Well,
shall the church say,
amen.
Get ready for it.
So here's the thing. I mean, I always like to say that we're looking for Martin Luther King when we also need to be looking for Fannie Lou Hamer. Yeah. And part of the intervention I think Black Lives Matter was able to make was to use police violence and very visible instances of police violence and state-sanctioned violence to also give contour to who was experiencing violence, to give contour to why. And because of your work, Kim, I think we were also able to say the face of violence in this country, meaning people who are experiencing state-sanctioned violence are not just heterosexual Black men. And when we did that, I think what we also created room for was actually the growth of a movement, because so many people from Black communities who have been kept out of mainstream Black politics said, oh, there's a place for me finally. And when we were able to do that, we were able to have different conversations about what's happening in our communities. We were able to have different conversations about issues, right? So we don't have to keep saying things like, how do Black people get to the middle class? Because we could talk about, well, can LGBT Black people ever get there, right? Can poor Black women ever get there? Can Black immigrants get there? Like, we could actually have a different kind of conversation about who is Black and what are Black people experiencing. I think the reality, though, is that, to be honest, there is a huge backlash to that. And it's come in several forms. I will say, to be 100% honest, that the biggest supporters of Black Lives Matter are Black women. And a lot of that has to do with the lived experience of being pushed to the side and having your work completely invisibilized. So it was Black women who said, oh, no, check this out. We are gonna make sure that y'all are good. We're gonna make sure that this story gets told correctly. And we're also going to make sure, because when we actually decided that we would come out and say that we started this thing, it was because Black male-dominated institutions were trying to claim it for themselves. Right. We were fine to be anonymous. Right. Until other folk were like, well, this is our thing, and then started to water down what it was that we were talking about. Yeah. So there is a backlash. There's a backlash on the level of, why are these Black women trying to change the way that we've always done things? So there's one. There's backlash on the very basic level of, who are these Black women who have tattoos and who are queer and who are immigrant and who are all of these different things? Who do you think you are? Literally. And then there's a backlash that is the one that we all know, right? The All Lives Matter, the Blue Lives Matter, there's all of that, which I call willful ignorance, right? That's like saying water is wet, the sky is blue, right? We know all lives matter, and they should matter, but they don't. And so this is the conversation we're trying to have. And I was saying to a friend earlier today, who asked me if I was surprised that people are so shocked by Black Lives Matter. I said, I'm not surprised by it. I actually think it's the lowest common denominator that we can be talking about. Like, if you actually believe all lives matter, then Black Lives Matter should not even be an issue for you. Right? But then there's a fundamental level that I don't think we talk about a lot, which is the backlash that is coming that is related to both Black Lives Matter and then intersecting with the Me Too movement. And this is a backlash that essentially says that Black men are getting beat up on and that Black men, there's not enough attention being paid to Black men. And there's an alignment that's happening, right, that I'm incredibly concerned about. Now, I don't know if people, and I don't know how much I want to go into this, but I'm just going to say it and we'll see what happens. There's a conversation right now that's happening about reparations. It's exciting. I like conversations about reparations. I think we should have more of them. They should be placed in a historical context. We should not act like the conversation about reparations is new. It is a long, not only conversation, but body of work. And it has never been intended to be exclusive to certain Black people. And there's a conversation that's happening under the guise of reparations that is essentially saying reparations should be limited only to American descendants of slaves. And the reason for that is because Black women, Black queer people, Black immigrants, and every other person in community of color is hijacking the potential that Black people can reach in terms of redress for wrongs that have been committed, okay? And why I'm concerned about that, right, is because it mirrors very closely, like a lot of us kept talking about Kanye being on one. Well, what Kanye was talking about and how Kanye was being used was for a very similar agenda. right? The conversation around black people exiting from the Democratic Party because of dissatisfaction around not being invested in, not being resourced, not being engaged, got hijacked, right? To then say, well, black people should leave the Democratic Party in favor of the Republican Party, which cares more about you. And when we saw those sit-downs between Donald Trump and Kanye West, what were the conversations? The conversations were about black fatherhood, black malehood, black business, right? It's gendered and it's racialized and it's classed and it's sexual identityized in a way that I think we should be concerned about. And the reason for that is it aims to roll back the openings that we have started to break open, not just with white America and understanding who black people are, but inside of black America and embracing the complexity of who black people are. If that strategy is successful, and if the coalition that is black people, because we don't all think the same, agree on everything, and I think if anybody's good at coalition politics, it's black people, right? But if that strategy is successful, I actually do think there are implications for 2020. Because the reason that the Democratic Party has not invested in black people is because they assume that black people are always going to go along and get along. We don't have to worry about bringing black people along with the Democratic Party agenda because we with you the whole time. But if a margin of that support erodes, that actually creates chaos for Democratic Party politics. And I don't think we've talked about that in a way that is nuanced enough or serious enough, to be honest.
So there are two things about what you're saying that so jump out at me. One is the fact that the male-focused pro-patriarchy, this is what they need. I want to throw Jim Brown in that conversation because he was part of it as well. But we do have to acknowledge that that's not just happened on the Republican side of the line. Let's remember that actually the point of departure for this conversation was the fact that my brother's keeper was lifting up this particular kind of narrative about what ails black people. What ails black people is our gender disrepair. You know, what we need is traditional two-family, heteronormative families. And until we get that going, we can't expect any other kind of program or intervention. And this is exactly at the same time that working women are being talked about in positive ways when it's not talked about in a black context. When even sexuality and gender and all of these issues are being embraced by, you know, the party, when it comes to black folks, we're back in Ozzie and Harriet land. So it is interesting that it's like a loaded gun on the table that can be picked up by the Republicans as well as the Democrats. So this is sort of like always sitting there, you know, sort of messing us up. So I'm hearing that, and I'm also hearing the lack of investment, right? So you go to Washington, D.C. and find out they don't have any plans to keep us mobilized. They think that it's just going to work out that way. And so here black women are kind of betwixt and between, you know, asking for it to be made. And so what it reminds me of is actually when you were trying to get to the White House to talk about something very important, and that is the fact that the aftermath of the first election created a huge wave of voter repression, right? It was happening across the country, and it was racial. But the post-racial party, the post-racial president, didn't want to hear it.
Not at all.
So talk a little bit about, you were talking about coalition, how you had to use coalitional politics basically to get in front of the Attorney General so that the re-election campaign was even possible.
Right. You know, and it's such a problem because, me and my big mouth, right? I guess you could say. You know, because I had the nerve to say that President Obama should have nominated a black woman to the Supreme Court.
Oh.
You know, and that made me persona non grata in the White House. Because I said I wasn't supporting Elena Kagan, because if a black president is going to appoint a black woman to the court, who is? And so I was raised in all kind of sand, and they said, okay, we got you. And that means you're banned from the White House.
And let me just underscore this. At the time, you are leading one of the major civil rights organizations in the country.
One of the largest.
For 25 years, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law was being led by Barbara Arnwine. During much of this time, particularly this time, you're also leading the fight against vote repression.
Yes.
But you are banned from the White House.
Well, and so, you know, there's
I'm just saying.
ultimate contradictions, right? So what happens is that while I'm banned, the 2010 midterm elections happen, our folks don't show up, don't show out, don't do anything because we're happy we got a black president. We just cruising with joy. And the post-racial narrative is just rolling. And so that's, so it's a real bizarre time. But I'm sitting in my office, and my staff starts, January the 5th, starts bringing me letters to sign about all these ugly, restrictive voting laws that were popping up as emergency must pass immediately legislation in the states. And so the first letter I signed, and I said, ooh, that's some ugly stuff. Strict voter ID. They're killing early voting. They just eliminated, election day registration. What the hell? And so then the next one comes, and I signed it, and I said, wait a minute. It's the ugly, strict voter ID, eliminating. I said, wait a minute. By the third letter, I said, wait. These letters are all looking the same to me. What's going on? Didn't I just sign this? And they said, no, that was for the other state. I said, but then I signed another one that was for the other state. I said, well, wait a minute. What's going on, people? And they said, well, we think there's this thing called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that is behind this model voter repressive legislation. And by the fifth letter, I said, this is horrid. We have to be mobilized. What's wrong with our community? Why aren't we calling this out? Why is all of this state by state? Why isn't there a national outcry about this? And folks were telling me, so I called a couple of folks and tried to go around and talk with them with my little notes and charts and showing people stuff. And they were like, Barbara, this is not the moment for this. In fact, people in the Democratic leadership sent a notice to me by one of my staff persons to tell me to hush up, to just shut my mouth.
And why?
Because they didn't want to hear it, because they, didn't want to play, quote, the race card. And so it was really ugly. And so you know how you commiserate? I don't know how you guys do, but I'm one of those who'll sit down at the table in the middle of the house and start fussing. I just fussing out loud. And so my son heard me, my 25-year-old son at that time, heard me fussing. And he came and he said, Mom, what is wrong? And I said, oh, Justin, you won't believe it. So I tell him the whole story. And he said, so you're having a communications problem? I said, big time. And he said, so what? So he says, Mom, he says, you know what? You need a map. I said, a map? He says, yes. He says, you need a really easy visual aid that people can immediately see it. I said, really? And he said, yes. And we could make it interactive. We could put it online. It could have its own hashtag, its own, handle. It could be on Instagram. I said, really? And he said, yes, Mom. And so I said, well, I'll be darned. So I went to work the next day and I looked at my staff and I said, I need a map. And we created what became known as the map of shame. So the map of shame leads to all kinds of reparations. I mean, people are going like, what the hell? Because I'm running around with my big old map, going around from place to place. The map's bigger than I am. It's at least 5-6 feet tall. And showing people what's going on and educating folks. 150 speeches in 2012, 100 speeches in 2011. But in 2011, all the civil rights groups are beginning to respond because Jesse Jackson picks it up and starts and helps. We put on some press conferences and start rolling with this thing. The media's acting stupid. They're like, oh, this is just a big conspiracy theory. We're not going to waste our ink on this and all this other stuff. So the bottom line is that we start organizing, and the language groups find out that I have been trying to get to the Attorney General. I have called his office, been, just the usual run around. And nothing's worse than a governmental run around. And because they pass you to every darn body. And then they pass you back. And, there's all this ugly stuff. So I'm getting the stone run around. So the good news is that the language groups, the Asian groups, and the Latino groups had a meeting scheduled with the Attorney General to talk about Section 203, the language accommodation provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And they called me up and they said, Barbara, we hear that you're having trouble getting in. I said, yeah, you heard right. And then they said, well, what about, they said, we got a 45-minute meeting. We're going to take that meeting. We're going to put you on as one of our attendees, and you bring your map. Bring your little map now, not the big map, because they're not going to let you in there. And you'll bring the little maps, and we're going to only take up 25 minutes of our 45 minutes. We're going to give you 20. And sure enough, we all got into the room, and Kim, after they ran through the 25-minute agenda, and everybody's going like, you're finished? They said, oh, no. Oh, no. Barbara's got something to say. And so I whipped out the map. And I'm really serious. That's how you roll, right? I whipped out the map. I laid it on the table in front of Attorney General Holder. And I said, Attorney General Holder, this is the map of shame. This is what's going down in this country right now on voter suppression. Look at these lawsuits. Look at these states that have all these horrible laws that they've been passing. The Justice Department's been nowhere in this fight. I said, Attorney General, this is happening on your watch. Your watch. He looked at me, and by the way, the minute I started speaking, the heads of his aides started going lower and lower. And by the time I ripped out the map, and they just put their heads on the table. I'm really serious. I had never seen anything like it in my lifetime. And because he banged the table with his fist, and he said, this is bullshit. He said, how has this happened? And everybody's. So, in other words, he then, because, Eric is just brilliant, he then started saying, listen, he says, I got this. He said, I'll take care of my litigation people. Yeah. He said, I got this, and I got my policy people. He said, but what I'm hearing, Barbara, is that there needs to be a public education campaign. And he says, let's talk about how we do that. John Payton was still alive at the time, was head of LDF, and Wade Henderson and others. And so we had a great talk, and that ended up with him giving the speech in that October, I believe. He gives a speech at the LBJ Library in Texas, in Austin, Texas. It becomes a big nationally publicized speech. Justice starts intervening on all kinds of cases, and the movement picks up. Now, I'm still banned. Let me be clear. Ain't nobody invite me to any White House meetings. I'm not welcome. I'm still unwelcome because they don't want me saying what I say. And people are getting so mad and frustrated that they literally are saying to them when they call them to come to the meetings, I ain't coming. They'll say, is Barbara invited? And they'll say no, and they say, I'm not coming. Or they'll go to the meeting and they'll say, I don't know why we're meeting. Because we need Barbara here because she knows more about all this stuff that we all do combined. And so finally, after the 2012 election, I am unbanned. That's it. That's the story. That's the story.
And then I came and got you in some more trouble, but we're not going to go there.
Right.
But you know, one of the links that I want us to think about. So part of what the Attorney General could do at the time was to bar some of these changes from going into effect because the Voting Rights Act was still on the table, and so that actually saved a lot of these elections. And now we see what happened without the Voting Rights Act, right? There's a whole lot to talk about that fifth vote, Clarence Thomas, that contributed to the Voting Rights Act being taken from us and our contribution to putting him there. But that's a conversation for another day. With the lying, right, and with not believing Anita Hill. I'm just going to say it. If we believed Anita Hill, then Clarence Thomas wouldn't have been on the Supreme Court.
Amen.
And we might still have the Voting Rights Act. And we might not have Trump in the White House.
Right.
However, there is the question about how this vote suppression actually played out in the midterms, particularly in what happened in Georgia.
Yes.
I want to tell y'all that I've been teaching voting rights with Barbara at UCLA, and you know, she insisted that we teach a case that I hadn't been teaching, and it's all about how data was used to identify the voting practices of black people and the voting practices of white people, eliminating all those things that black people did, like early voting, right, and all souls to the polls, and retaining those things that white voters did. And they were explicit about asking about this information. So it wasn't like, oh, gee, I wonder why this happened this way. They told us why they were doing it. And this is something that was, you know, finally struck down, but this is the level of vote repression. So there's that on that side. And then there's what we were talking about earlier, this 77% white woman thing. So Nia, I want to come back to you and just get a sense of the difference between the strategies that are being talked about. So we might think about one strategy being the go all the way blue strategy, right? Dig deep, activate voters who haven't been activated, really, you know, strike hard on some of the issues and hope to just peel off 4, 5, 6% of the, I mean, we don't need all of them. We just need 4 or 5%. So that's kind of the blue strategy.
Right.
But then what seems to be talked about now is the go purple strategy. So let's try to move the entire political discourse in the Democratic Party more to purple and perhaps borderline red to try to capture those Trump voters, particularly those Trump women. So is this an accurate sort of depiction about the debate?
Yeah,
and where does it land?
I think that's right. Those two strategies, sort of deep blue or purple, you might even, another way to look at it is sort of the Rust Belt versus the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt strategy being, could a Democratic candidate for president win a state like Arizona? Could you win North Carolina as a Democrat in the way that Obama did in 2008? Of course, he lost it in 2012. Is Georgia ready to come online as a Democratic state that a Democrat could win in 2020? And the other part of that is, and I don't even know if the idea for the purple strategy is so much about white women as it is about the idea of white working class voters, particularly in the Rust Belt, particularly sort of disaffected white men who don't have those same factory jobs. So the idea somebody like Biden can go, you know, Scranton, a guy from Scranton, grew up in Scranton, can go into those factories and into the Rust Belt and talk to those voters. Beto O'Rourke, for instance, saying he's going to go everywhere, right? He's going to go to the rural parts of Iowa. He's going to go to Des Moines, Iowa. He's going to go everywhere and talk to every voter. Obviously didn't work well for him in Texas. He didn't didn't really get a lot of those voters, he was able to swell the voters in urban areas, as did most Democrats who ran, like Stacey Abrams, like Gillum as well in Florida. But yeah, I mean, those are the sort of two strategies, and I think you'll see the candidates figure out what is the most viable strategy for them. Kamala Harris probably more of a Sun Belt candidate, and then somebody like Biden would be the Rust Belt candidate. And I think sort of the ultimate idea for a lot of voters you talk to and a lot of Democrats you talk to is that the ultimate outcome would be a purple ticket, because Biden would be at the top and Kamala Harris or some other woman would be at the bottom of that ticket. So, you know, we'll see what happens. I think if you think about what did happen in 2016, basically 80,000 votes, right, in 3 states.
Yes.
So the idea that it was sort of a cataclysmic event in terms of the way people voted, not really, right? I mean, you think about Obama won Pennsylvania by like 600,000 votes. I mean, it's just sort of a massive reshaping of the map in a way that Trump didn't really do. So the question is, do you go for the people who stayed home? There was a drop-off, obviously, in African-American voters, a drop-off in young voters as well, the sort of Obama coalition. Do you go after those voters, or do you hope and pray that the voters who voted for Obama in 2012 and then voted for Trump in 2016, do you think you can go get those voters? The thing about those voters, though, is that they were Republican voters in many ways. They had a Republican voting history, and then they flipped to Obama, and then they flipped back to Trump. So this idea that somehow, you know, if you're Joe Biden or if you're Beto O'Rourke, I mean, maybe you can get those voters. I mean, it is proven that Obama was able to activate a part of the Democratic Party that hadn't been activated, and you wonder if that might be the easiest strategy. Right. Kamala Harris will test it, Biden will test a different sort of strategy.
And the question was, did they stay mobilized? Did they
Right.
continue to mobilize them? And there is a narrative that once they got activated, it's like, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and we're moving on. I'm going to go to questions in a moment, so raise your hands so we can get ready, but I want to do 2 quick hits. Data. So you've got something going now called Black Futures Lab, and help us think about how data can be used to enhance Black well-being through politics, through other means, because we've basically been seeing data kind of being used against us. So what are you trying to do with data, and what are some of the lessons that might come out of it?
Well, we're trying to turn data on its head, in a way. So we got tired after the 2016 election of people talking about Black folks but not talking to us. And the result of that, again, is that when people are seeking our votes, they're talking about things in such a way that the control is the experience of those white working class mythical voters that aren't coming out to do the thing that Black folks have been doing for a minute. And so we started a project called the Black Census Project, which is the largest survey of Black people done since Reconstruction. And what we did is we asked Black people all over the country, what are you experiencing in the economy, in our democracy, in our society, and what do you want to see for your future? We collected more than 30,000 responses from liberals and conservatives, from LGBT folks and heterosexual folks, from rural and urban, from folks who are currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, folks who are U.S. born and born outside of the U.S. And we'll be releasing the responses next month. But the thing that's really interesting that you should know is that the number one piece of feedback that we got about this survey was that nobody has ever asked me these questions. And you'll be interested to know also that many of the people who took our survey, even though they are spread out across the country, these are not people who were all surveyed by the same people. We built partnerships with more than 30 grassroots Black-led organizations in 28 states across the country. Everybody administered their survey the same, but it wasn't the same people administering the survey. Not everybody got the same questions, right? Like we really tried to diversify so that we could actually say, this is what Black folks are saying across the country, and you would be surprised how similar it is, even across the differences that we were intentional about. Every single person is saying, not only is nobody asking me what I need or what I want, but the other piece that I think is kind of fascinating, actually, is that people are saying, I prefer an organization that speaks to my experiences and speaks from my experiences. So from that 30,000 people who responded, 11,000 people said, I want to stay engaged, meaning we did not require people to give us their contact information to participate. So a third of those people said, I need to stay engaged. That's pretty large if you know data, right? Last thing I want to say about this survey, and I think this piece is really important. What we started to understand very clearly from the responses is that it's not rocket science. What we did was take our community organizing hats and say, how do we use this in service of our goals in 2020, which is to get rid of Trump and Trumpism, right? And to create more political space for us to transform democracy. How do we do that? We are not, a big organization. We're a year old. We put $500,000 or more into the field, resourced Black organizations, and we were able to touch a whole lot of folk. What if the Democratic Party did that?
Yes.
How would politics change in this country? We also have started to think about, well, how do we influence candidates to think differently about how you engage with our communities? Because frankly, it's not enough to keep saying things like tax cuts for the middle class, or we support affordable health care. It's like when you talk to Black women in the South, that's great. We support affordable health care too, but the attacks on health care are unique to Black people in the South, right? Like there is a uniqueness to how healthcare is being attacked, and if you're not addressing that as a candidate, you are not getting Black folks behind you. That's a problem. So I know there's a lot of people that love Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders talks about inequality. Bernie Sanders is like deep in the let's get rid of corporations out of politics. Like he's deep in all that, right? You would think that'd be something Black folks would be down for, given the way that corporations are decimating Black communities. He doesn't have a huge Black following. Why is that? Because he only will talk about class. He won't talk about the relationship between race and class. He's just not good at it. It's something maybe he's trying to do, but that has an impact on politics. And when people are mad about what happened in the primary in 2016, and people say, well, Hillary stole it, or, Bernie was the person, it's like, cool, that can be true. What can also be true is Black folks were not lining up at the door pulling the lever for Bernie Sanders, and we have to ask ourselves why. And any successful campaign in 2020 is also going to ask itself, why aren't Black folks lining up behind me? And what can I do? That's why you have Joe Biden dangling this carrot saying, well, if I make Stacey my vice president. And they're testing, really, can we get Black folks' support? So it's something for us to pay attention to.
I'm dying to ask a question, but let me collect yours, and then I'll attach mine to what y'all ask. How about that? So let me see some questions, if there are some, right here.
You all have talked a lot about a lot of the legacies of who's been doing this work and who's been doing it in ways that are comprehensive and thorough in terms of talking about blackness, gender, all these types of things. And I was wondering if you all could kind of speak to the way that particularly something like the Combahee River Collective, in the name itself, but also in the politics that it espoused, the way that it kind of not only like talked about how we could move forward within the system, but also kind of separated from it, particularly in the way that it's grounded itself in socialism, and what that can look like for us to really see like all of these candidates who are trying to get black voters, but that like the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party and the entire system as a whole isn't really checking for black people, but particularly black women.
Great, thanks. Another question? Right here.
Good evening. Good evening. Am I on? Okay. I've often wondered when you speak of getting votes and being successful, is there a certain age group you go after? Is there a certain geographic area, educational background? I've always wondered because I've been a voter ever since I had the opportunity to vote and was very proud to do so. So for one to feel that they are successful, who is it that you go after and what age group are you targeting to know that you're going to be successful?
Okay. So I think that question goes to you. Let me throw some in that y'all can sort of jump in if you want. You know, we're in Hollywood. We had a conversation last year about casting and black women. And I want to just kind of wonder if there's a connection between the role of colorism and just what looks like the part of a president and what doesn't. So let's imagine we were casting a movie for Hollywood was casting a movie, and it's about the first black woman president. My hunch is that nobody, you know, darker than Regina King would even get called to come in, right? We expect that to play out in Hollywood. We don't like it, but we know that's what goes down. We don't talk about that so much in politics, but yet there seems to be casting going on. I mean, when people talk about Stacey Abrams, does she look like a governor? To me, I'm thinking, okay, are we having a casting issue here? Is it playing a role? So I'm interested in what you all think about how the handicapping of her chances might be reflective of some of the same stuff happening on the other side of the country that happens here. I'm also interested in, and Nia, this might be for you. You report a lot about black voters and black politicians. Do you have a sense of what a black woman's political agenda might look like, or what does politics look like if black women's, priorities were not so marginalized? And I think that might also be something that goes to some of the things that you've introduced. Even though you're not a majority black district, there are some things that you're introducing that wouldn't happen if you weren't there, right? And then finally, there really is, when we talk about backlash, we talk about internal backlash, but then there's external backlash. There's this black identity extremism stuff happening that, to me, isn't this COINTELPRO stuff all over again? Do people know this history? Where is that conversation and where does it need to go at this particular point? So these can be thought of as summaries and final words to our wonderful audience. So can we start with you?
Sure. So we love voters like you. We love older voters who are well educated. You all tend to come out in special elections and all elections. And so when you're looking at getting as many votes as possible, we have a ton of formulas and algorithms and schematics. And when you need to spread your money as far as possible, you go towards high propensity voters, and they tend to be older educated voters. There is colorism. When I first ran for the Los Angeles Community College Board, it is an at-large seat. It's for the entire county of Los Angeles. I had conversations, very real conversations with my consultant about what slate mail I put my face on and what slate mail went out with just my name. Sidney Kamlager. You wouldn't know who that person was. And I was unhappy with that strategy, and because it was an at-large seat for the entire county, I used that strategy and was successful. So in black communities, I put my face on so they knew that I was legit. And in other communities, I didn't. And I just went with, doing the things that you would normally do. And it's very real. And we have got to move the dial and have very uncomfortable conversations about why people still employ those strategies to get elected. Here, as I mentioned, we have 4 black women in the legislature, but we are very powerful. We are doing things that are helping everyone. You have a sister who is chair of Senate Budget. You have a sister who is chair of Budget Sub 5 on public safety. You have a sister who has a select committee on incarcerated women. You have a sister who is bringing forth a bill on eliminating lethal force so that we are not having to deal with seeing our brothers and our sisters killed in the streets. Because of black women, you have legislation and budget items that talk about funding Black Babies for Wellness and looking into implicit bias in the medical community, in our courts, in our law, with our law enforcement. You have black women talking about maternal health, and looking at that data to figure out how we can stop some of these deaths from happening in stillbirths in communities of color. When we have to have hard conversations on the floors, black women are the ones who are tapped to say, can you exercise your voice of the moral compass of this house so that we can move the agenda forward? Now, these might be issues you have a legislation running through that talks about the protection of natural hair to protect braids and locks.
That's right.
Yes. Now, these are all laws. These are all pieces of legislation that are being carried and championed by the sisters that are in the legislation, that are in the legislature, in the body. Now, we're also talking about a whole host of other things. But we also know that by fighting and getting these things passed, it will actually be helping everyone. But we are just using the lens from which we come to sort of elevate these conversations that have been marginalized and invisibilized or are only being talked about in homes of black homes.
And if you're not there, it's not on the table. Right. All right. Barbara.
Yes. On the issue of the age group, one of the age groups that I really work hard with is the youngest voters, because we forget that younger voters, if you take a diagram and you mapped out the views, policy considerations, and desires of people over 60, and you went to the opposite spectrum and did the politics, policies, and desires of people between 18 and 30, they're like polar opposites. And a lot of what's wrong is that younger category needs to be voting as aggressively as the 60 and olders do. Our whole body politic changes because what they want has no relationship to what's sitting in the White House right now, has no relationship to what is sitting in the Senate and controlling the Senate. Their policies are so radically different than what we consider, here that and they're good on so many good issues. So I think that, my commitment with my old butt has been to work with younger folks to really, motivate, as much voting as I can, and as much registration, much advocacy. In fact, next week I'll be on college campuses talking with young activists about how to, get our vote on and how to keep building this movement, because that's what is really needed. It's a very ignored cadre. The other thing I just want to say is that, one of the stats that most people missed. And in fact, when I gave that stat to the CBC, Reverend Jesse Jackson asked me to come meet with him with the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus. And I said, they were talking about strategies and concerns for 2018 at that time, 2020. And I said, well, the biggest concern is, you know, in 2016, you had 2 million less black ballots counted in the presidential election. It's the first decrease in the voter ballots counted for blacks. Now, when I say counted, you notice I didn't say turnout, because a lot of black ballots get spoiled and get tossed out by a lot of this voter suppression nonsense. And so, I talked about what that looks like and how it affected this election, not to mention something nobody wanted to talk about at that moment, which was the Russian interference. A whole lot of black folks, thought they were cool because they were following folks on social media who were telling them, don't vote. Be cool, don't vote. Or we're telling them, you better not go to the polls because you're going to be arrested, whatever. They were doing everything they could to suppress the black vote, and lots of that was Russian-based. They had black faces on those Twitter accounts, black faces on those Facebook accounts, black political organizational names, and all of those were run by Russians. Right now, a dose. I'm not going to get all into it, because we got to have a war up in here. But
yes.
But we know that this whole movement's telling black folks that they have no alignment with immigrants, black immigrants. That they have no alignment with blacks throughout the African diaspora. That we have nothing in common. That we're only U.S. based is ridiculous. W.E.B. Du Bois would just, oh my God. And all the others, who fought. Think about it, Dorothy Height, every black leader in history who was worth something was internationalists. Fannie Lou Hamer, all of them. We got to understand that this movement right now, and guess what? We've done some studies on where some of these accounts coming from. I'm not talking about leadership because I don't know much about the leadership. But a lot of those accounts that have been jumping on my case, because I talk about problems with killing people like Marielle in Brazil, and I talk about anti-black racism worldwide, and I talk about other stuff, and they've been jumping on me. Oh, sister, we need you to focus on the U.S., and we don't want you distracted. Like I can't think, right? Multi dimensions. It's just ridiculous. So it's really important that we be careful, because we tracked some of those accounts back to Russians. Yeah. They're all Russian controlled. Again, so they got a new strategy. That is to get up inside the reparations debate, mess with it when it's such a critical issue, destroy it. Keep talking about Republican candidates who people ought to be supporting, and dividing our unity among the African diaspora is sick. It's very bad. And we need to be very smart. That one of the things that we got to do this time is that we can't get caught in that mess. And we got to be smarter than that. And do you want me to talk about Harriet now?
Yeah, I'll give you the last word on
Okay.
Harriet. Let me get the last two,
Okay.
and you take us home with Harriet.
All right.
Go ahead.
The black woman's agenda, I think, is the question you have for me. I think the sort of template for thinking about the black woman's agenda and what it might look like and what a candidate might look like who has a candidacy focused on the black woman's agenda, it's Stacey Abrams. I mean, this race that she ran in Georgia, I continue to be impressed by what she did there. And the folks who she got out to vote in that race were voters she had registered, right? I mean, that has been central to her identity, central to what she wanted to do in Georgia, and almost did in Georgia. We'll see if she runs either for senator in 2020 or governor again in a rematch with Brian Kemp. But if you looked at the way in which she ran, she very much centered her own story. She wasn't afraid to talk about her blackness. She wasn't afraid to talk about her natural hair. She wasn't afraid to talk about her unique experiences as a black woman and what that meant in terms of being in debt, right? And being, I mean, we all, you know, in black families, often it's the black woman who has to multitask and is sort of the person who is the linchpin financially, and people are, you know, supporting other family members. So she talked about that. She obviously talked about criminal justice reform. She talked about voting rights. She talked about public education, investing in public education, as well as expanding Medicaid. So I think that is a race. I mean, if Stacey Abrams ends up transforming Georgia, either in you know, in this next election in 2020, or if she runs again and wins, that has tremendous power in terms of what the country will look like in terms of these southern states where the majority of African Americans are, in states like Alabama, states like South Carolina. So that's a race where she ran as an unapologetically black woman in Georgia. And so I think that is a race
and almost won.
And almost won. No, I think that's right. Almost won.
Wait.
All right.
Yes. Go ahead, Alicia.
Wait a minute, she won.
She won.
But Brian Kemp stole it.
Right. All right, now.
Stole it. So, you know, ballots disappearing, voting machines with no plugs. I mean, people waiting in lines for 3-4 hours. I saw the whole thing. She won the race. She won the race.
But Barbara
all I
calls
gotta
it a
say about
crime
that.
scene.
It was a crime scene.
And we've talked about from vote suppression to voter depression. So, you know, how do we come back from that? So you go ahead, talk just for a minute or two about the identity extremists. Give us your thought about where we go with that, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Well, Black identity extremists is a new designation for Black Lives Matter activists. And it is not the first time that the government has come up with terms that identify black activists and organizers with terrorism or terrorists. But certainly what we know historically about that strategy has been that it's been used against some of the most powerful black radical organizations like the Black Panther Party, and it's been used to decimate and create chaos both within and between, right, organizations by both creating suspicion, right, about either who's working with the government, who's not working with the government, or it has also very much, I think, been used to create a climate of distrust of those movements themselves. And in a post 9/11 environment where terrorism is associated with religion and with extremism, it's not a surprise, right, that there would be an attempt to denigrate support for a movement that has pretty good support amongst black folks and even some interesting support amongst white communities, and certainly a lot of support among communities of color throughout the country. So what do we need to know about this? What we need to know is that we are under an administration that prioritizes and has been explicit about saying they prioritize law and order. And law and order really means for some, because, you know, we have an administration that's breaking laws every single day. And at the same time, we should be aware that the increase of activism that people are being engaged in and are engaging in themselves to protect the rights that we do have left and defend them is game for targeting by labels like this. So it's being banned from the White House, right? Was banned under that administration. We'll talk about that another time. We'll talk about that another time. But it is also very much being targeted for what you're doing. And so many activists and organizers that I'm in relationship to, from the Women's March to the climate movement, are being visited by the FBI.
Yes.
Are being questioned, are being surveilled, and that's not conspiracy theory. This is well documented, right? Color of Change ran a campaign to try to release the FBI records, right, of their surveillance and monitoring of Black Lives Matter activists. That there's been another kind of suit that's been filed to try to get them to release that information. So it's just important for us to understand that this work does not come without risk, and the work that Black women are doing to change the political landscape is not without risk. And frankly, right, it's not lost on me, right, that in this play, we saw Harriet's heart be broken over and over and over again. And my goal, and what I think about every single day, is what kind of work do we need to be doing to mend those heartbreaks? That's why we engage in politics, not because we care about Democrats or Republicans or whatever. It's like because we care about mending the heartbreaks in our communities.
Y'all see why I roll with these sisters right here. Please join me in thanking Alicia, Nia, Barbara,
This is great.
and the Assemblywoman, Kamala Kardashian.
This was great.
Let me also thank some folks. Thank you, Hammer, Claudia, and your great staff for making this possible. And I want to give a shout out to AAPF staff. You see them running literally around with AAPF t-shirts. Naima, Madeline, Julia, Jira, Michael, Eden, Lisa, and Kevin. Please join us tomorrow. We're taking up the question of Say Her Name, the Lives That Should Have Been. We'll be joined by many of the mothers of women who have been killed by the police. Rhonda Dormius is right here in the front row. Many of you probably heard her on Intersectionality Matters. So they'll be with us tomorrow. So please stay with us. Barbara, you get the final word. Quick word on Harriet.
Well, most people don't know that Harriet Tubman would go to the White House all the time because she was very close with Abraham Lincoln's wife, and she would go visit her. But every time she went to the White House, she refused to visit and meet with Abraham Lincoln himself. I mean, she had, scores of visits. I mean, she would go there sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, but she would never meet with him. Why? Because she said his policies were wrong for Black people. She didn't like where he stood on, post-emancipation. She had all kind of issues about equality, and she refused to meet with him. And Sojourner Truth, of course, met with him. And there's a famous photo of the two of them. And she said that in some of her memoirs, when people interviewed her about this, about why wouldn't she meet with Lincoln, she said, well, Sojourner got on me for that. And I told her that I didn't want to be a photo op. This is way back. All right? So let's, when we are talking about using our political power, just think about how you stand on principle and how that is so critical to any success. And Black women, that's something we know how to do. Thank you.